What do these two events have to do with one another? First, you have a judge in northern Illinois who was appointed by the Obama administration, either affirming or applying the Second Amendment to those who have entered the country illegally. And then soon following, you have the White House under the Biden administration making overtly political statements affirming the Transgender Day of Visibility very clearly over Easter weekend. The answer to these two questions, the answer to this final question, is strategy, and that strategy might be informed by ideology. But before we get into it, I want to toss it over to this channel's sponsor, Obsidian Arms, who makes a series of armor's tools and punches, one set specifically for an AR-15, which I recently used to put together a BRN 180 lower, and it includes things like a Delrin punch set, or a Delrin punch for starting triggers and hammer pins, as well as a tool for setting your breakdown pin retaining pins, one of the easiest pieces to lose, much more so in a chaotic garage. But they also provide OEM services, and much of gun culture is fueled by the ingenuity of garage-based ideas, something that people started, like even Barrett Firearms originally began in a garage. But that idea, taking that idea and bringing it to life, is something that they can help provide for those of us who are trying to take something that we think will add value to the culture and to our community and turn it into something that we could bring to market. And so their OEM, or original equipment manufacturing capabilities, not only include making a 3D model of your product and taking a design and turning it into something that can be looked at through the computer, but then they can also turn it into real life. They can actually craft it in their own machine shop, which they use US materials. And so if you are either looking for tools to complete your armor's kit, like a set of punches that have a lifetime warranty, or you're particularly interested in a design that you've completed or you're nearing completion, but you're just trying to figure out how to get it made here in America, go check out Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. They're based out of Minnesota. I've known of their company for some years now, and they are a pleasure to work with. So back to the episode and back to these two questions that on their first glance may not really appear to be all that related. On the one hand, let's start with the judge in northern Illinois. And if we can start by pushing some of the identity off to the side and focus on the claims that are being made, there's an ability, I believe, if we look at the philosophical history of the Second Amendment, we may not dismiss, but disperse quite a bit of the tension around this subject. Politically speaking, you might have hard libertarians on one hand arguing that of course it applies to everybody, whereas those who are a little bit more cautious of the games afoot or who are looking for politics to work in their favor, not even nefariously so, we may ask questions on why this rule is being apparently applied unevenly. And again, we'll start with the people aside and then bring in this strategy and this argument as we go forward. So the claims of the Second Amendment rely primarily in our history in what we've oftentimes or what the founding fathers or what we believe that the Second founded on are this idea of a human right. A human right is something that you, in a sense, possess, or you have a combination of obligations and responsibilities, or liberties in a sense, and responsibilities, or liberties and obligations, rights and obligations that you are in a sense in possession of by virtue of being a human. They're not granted by something greater than you, like the state, but they are granted by something greater than you, like being created in the image of God, or being a human being specifically. And this, in a sense, has a rationality to it. And that rationality understands that whether you're born in America or Venezuela or Colombia or Russia, you are a human being. We are all human beings on this earth. And if we were going to claim human rights for a group of people in one country, it would only follow that we would apply those human rights to individuals born in another country. And in a sense, we are all humans after all. And if it's a human right, then we would all be, in a sense, in possession of it. However, though, rights are not in that it's not that they're not absolute. It's that rights have to contend with what happens when a person deliberately infringes or invades on another person's right. And the most classic example of this might be to attempt murder. Does a person who attempts murder, in a sense, deprives themselves of that right that they possess? They deprive themselves of the negative right that others are obligated not to do harm to them, particularly those they are seeking to murder. This also can apply to property, for if a person is seeking to deprive another of their rightfully owned property, they are creating a problem that them being in possession of this right, them bearing this right to bear, in the Second Amendment sense, the right to bear arms, doesn't stick. It might be, in a sense, voided or removed from them, or it's not even removed, but it is that they are voided in that sense. So what this logic, this reasoning might follow then, that a person who enters into a foreign country illegally is with the particular intent of pillaging the resources of that country, even without viewing or presenting the aesthetic of a thief, challenges their claim to certain rights. If a person invades another country, then they do not have, then they place themselves in jeopardy of another defending or exercising their individual right to self-preservation and to their property. And so you could make a pretty strong argument here that on the grounds that someone who enters the country illegally does so not even if they are wearing the clothes of an invading army. What they do is that they are essentially taking from the rightful property of the citizens of that land. And if that is the status that they ascertain, but if that becomes their status, then them having a right to bear arms is in jeopardy, because by nature of me going to a person's house to steal their property, it does not mean that I still retain my right, in a sense, to bear arms in self-defense, because it isn't self-defense when I am the aggressing party. Now, this is something that we might engage with, or we might have to believe, not even have to believe, but we believe on the basis of a reasonable approach to human rights, reasonable not being convincing or rhetorically pleasing, but reasonable and not contradicting itself. But we have a problem here. It illustrates now that the judge that we are talking about, or this condition that we might consider about on what foundation our rights exist, and what is the extent that those rights reach to, we might recognize that there are limitations on it, not entirely on the basis of, say, what a civil right may be, which is something that is or granted or in authority of the government, and even if the government is of, for, and by the people, that civil rights are something that we provide amongst ourselves through our participation in the greater populace, in politics in its maybe clearest form or cleanest form. But it goes a step further with what might be illustrating the ideology and the religion of the judge in Northern Illinois. It's something that they may believe in. And what they may be believing in is that they don't believe in the human right or the Second Amendment in the same way that we do. Rather, they believe it as merely a civil right that is granted or withheld by the government. And then the Second Amendment, not being a human right, being rather, in this case, a civil right, is something that they, by nature of being within the government or they're holding a position as a judge, gets to choose where it is, where it stands and where it doesn't. Or we could also just distill this argument into a game of teams, our team versus their team, where the judge believes for some reason that a person who enters this country illegally is part of their team, so to speak. And you see this language appear in political conversations surrounding the subject. But a third one, and this is what I think is a little bit more nefarious, a little bit more of the, not only the threat and the danger that it presents, but what I believe that ties it ideologically and thus, as a result, strategically to the actions of the Biden administration affirming the Transgender Day of Visibility over Easter weekend. So the strategy, or at least what it appears like, wittingly or otherwise, appears to be to assert one's values as if they were also like our values, without illustrating the source of those values. And so only to condemn, and what this does is this, in a sense, creates a form of entryism, although entryism tends to be more like, you don't have enough of my representation in your group, therefore you're obligated to accept me, even if not elevate me to positions of authority, because there aren't enough X people in your institution. Your institution is obligated to hire me and promote me to the position of CEO. That would be entryism. Rather, what I think is more likely here is a form of something like ideological colonialism. Now, you might say, well, redacted, that's the iron law of woke projection. And of course, that's what it would look like. So let's flesh it out. The strategy, at least in this sense, appears to be appealing to values that one does not hold, but rather are held by people that maybe they do not get along with, to put it casually, or maybe a target. And then once they assert themselves into that group by saying we have the same values, then they change the game, saying that if you do not hold the values, your values, which I didn't hold in the beginning, but I do now, if you don't hold those values in the same way that I do, then there's a distinction between us and them within this framework. It might also look something like the use of force in ideologies that believe in in preemptive self-defense. But let's change stories really quick. Let's go over to, or change events to, what took place over Easter weekend. For Easter, the implication of Joe Biden's proclamation presents two layers. First, there's affirmation. He makes public statements affirming the Transgender Day of Visibility. And the very idea of the Transgender Day of Visibility requires, not even inspires, but almost demands by language, demand affirmation. And what is affirmation? Affirmation is outwardly expressing something to be true. You could imagine in an old Roman time, it is, you must claim that Caesar is God. You must claim that Mao is perfect. You must claim certain things about the government or an individual or the identity of a person to be true. Affirmation in the sense is making public declarations that what the identity of a person, the claimed identity of a person, is true. Let me rephrase that because I believe it's important. In this sense, affirmation is publicly claiming that a person's declared identity also is true. And so if we take out the keywords here, maybe the identity words here, but we say a person is making public claims about another person, about their claimed identity as being true, what we see here is a form of worship. And that worship is in direct contradiction with what we are claimed or what we are commanded to worship in the Bible, in Christianity. You shall have no other gods, and you shall build no idols for yourself. Christ and the triune God claims to be the one true God. There shall be no other gods before me. And so, in this sense, what Biden is doing is that he is saying, whether wittingly or otherwise, that on your day where you are commanded or you have set aside to affirm and worship Christ for not only dying for our sins, but being raised from the dead, you are also supposed to affirm this other belief. And you can't really affirm both things at the same time, or at least that's what Christians are going to have to deal with. But I think the strategy here is to assert and encourage in not only political allies in this sense, but in the greater culture or in our country, that there is no contradiction between being queer and Christianity. And he is implying, and by doing so, implying that one is merely an aesthetic and a lifestyle, and the other is a religion. And you might think, well, yes, being queer is really just a lifestyle. Queer, this identity without a essence, belief system, is just a lifestyle, whereas Christianity is a religion. But I warn you, it's actually the other way around. Joe Biden, by proclaiming to affirm the Transgender Day of Visibility, is claiming that transgenderism, which is a state worshiping religion, in the words of James Lindsay, a bit of a suicide cult. I mean, if that's not a direct quote, please forgive me and correct me. But in this sense, you have a stated religion, now by literally the government, saying that you must affirm that which is this transgenderism queer argument, even if it comes in the aesthetic or the look of Christianity. And so what this does, this is that strategy where now, by making a claim that there is no contradiction between the two, even though there's going to be, and perhaps even though they know there's going to be, they know that there's going to be a division there, they know that there's going to be contradictions and challenges, and intellectual injury could be inflicted or a moral injury could be inflicted. What we have then is the opportunity for those who claim that there is no contradiction to then assert that there's now a distinction between good Christians and bad Christian nationalists. And we've already seen the language start to develop around this, where what it means to be a Christian nationalist is that our rights are what our rights, the belief that our rights come from God, not government. I'll kind of put that back together one more time. There's this strategy being laid out before us that asserts that there is no distinction between our state-sanctioned ideology and your religion of sorts, or the religion of Christianity, that there is no contradiction, that those two live together in harmony. And when the inevitable conflict tears at those two ideologies because they both make truth claims that are directly contradictory to each other, namely in the identity of God, because an identity without an essence is a self-sufficient identity, and the only thing that can be a self-sufficient identity must then be God. Aristotle's argument of the first mover and Anselm's, and we go on from there. And so what then it allows there to be is not a divide and conquer strategy, but a invade and colonize strategy. So just like the judge in North Illinois is applying or is appealing to virtues or values that she may not even hold, she is providing an opportunity for there to be a fusion, maybe even a Hegelian dialectic of two things that are in contradiction with another, with the idea of creating a thesis, antithesis, synthesis, a synthesizing of these two ideas. And the fruit of that synthesis is a contradiction a contradiction between those who believe that rights, human rights, come from the government, like the right to bear arms, that the right to bear arms, the division is between those who believe the Second Amendment comes from the state and those who believe the core values that inform the Second Amendment are actually from human nature being created in the image of God, that an individual has a sense of sovereignty, not to be sovereign citizens, but a sense of obligations not to infringe on another's individual human right, but that these ideas, this human right, is only a human right because we are humans, and the thing that implies that that human right be even in existence at all is that it comes from something greater than government, because ultimately governments are constituted of humans. And so if you believe that you have rights that come from something greater than another human being, now you're a Christian nationalist, or you are a right-wing extremist, or a gun culture extremist, or something like that. And then because somebody who is identified as one of these things, a Christian nationalist over here, or whatever the militia language, the gun version is now, because that word, that title, that condemnation changes frequently. But whatever you are over here, now them, by nature of their belief, their circular belief, that rights, or this transgenderism, this right of an individual to self-defense in the case of Northern Illinois, and the right to bear arms, or in the affirmation of one's essentially right to declare sense of their own identity, because you have created this contradiction between these two, or not between these two, because you have asserted these things to be true, anyone who denies those not only is an affront to your religion, but a threat to the state. The circular argument of the state is what grants you all rights, because there are no such things as human and civil rights, and because those rights, your right to bear arms being granted by the state, can also be taken away by the state, and it's even up to the state's prerogative in that argumentation to discern by its own will who does and doesn't have that right. If we appeal to heaven in this sense, we can make sense of why it might not be appropriate. It may not actually be an infringement of an individual's right to bear arms if they illegally enter the country, to prohibit them from the possession of firearms, essentially, in some concern, turning themselves into invaders of a sorts. That same strategy that I've been outlining here, the strategy of asserting that there is no contradiction between my ideology and your ideology, subjugating one from or identifying one as an ideology and subjugating the other as a mere aesthetic, what it does is it appeals like a wolf in sheep's clothing to be one of us, but ultimately the intent is to instill a contradiction, wittingly or unwittingly, that causes a rift that allows the state to identify individuals who do not honor its absolute sovereignty as enemies, not only on a criminal level, but on a theological level. That the identity of somebody who doesn't affirm the state's authority over all rights as civil rights is the identity of an individual who is not just a threat to that state, or a threat to affirming the queer, that they are by their nature deserving or worthy of forms of violence to be wielded against them by nature of what they are. This is a holy war disguised as a wolf in sheep's clothing. So the two events are the same event. They're just similar descriptions of the same strategy, which would be invade, contradiction, punish the non-believer, colonize, colonize such that it produces a contradiction, and then punish those who do not go along with the thing that colonized to produce the contradiction. This strategy is informed by an ideology, a theology of sorts, which identifies the self and, most importantly, the state as the supreme being in reality. In effect, affirm me or die. Let me restate that. It is affirm me, worship me, the state which grants the rights. By granting this idea of the right of Transgender Day of Visibility, then it is affirming its own authority over mankind. Affirm the state or die. Bow Caesar or die. And that ideology that the self is the supreme authority over reality, that the self, or the not even in a solipsistic sense, but in this worldview, it provides this theology provides grounds on which the strategy of colonize, contradict, and then condemn is produced. And so if this episode has been useful to you, or if you see other examples of this strategy, this threefold strategy, colonize, contradict, and condemn, if you see this implemented in other places, go ahead and leave it in the comments below. I'm sure we're going to have a bit of a spicy conversation. And if you want to support the show, you can, first of all, head over to obsidianarms.com. If nothing else, go check out their punch set. If you're tooling around and you're building guns and you're building components, their tools come with a lifetime warranty, and I can't thank them enough for being the first sponsor of this channel. They believe in you. They believe in adding to the intellectual tools of gun culture, and they bring something to the table that all of us can benefit from. I'm very thankful. So that's enough. Let's call it gushing. And if you want to support me, if you want to support our work, I have a t-shirt. If you're watching this as it's coming out, I have a t-shirt on pre-sale right now that has a list of individuals on it that has been revealed by public records, but might be worth checking out. So you want to head over to redactedllc.com, check that out, support the show. You can also join in some of the conversation on redactedculture.locals.com. And with that, I'm closing out. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast. Now go forth and conquer.